We recently completed a series exploring how super mutants arrived at Appalachia. This took us to Huntersville, the West Tech Research Facility, and the Emmett Mountain Disposal Site. There we found many pieces to this puzzle, but with this video I want to organize the pieces to the puzzle into a cohesive story, and we'll also explore other unmarked locations that reveal even more clues. To understand how super mutants arrived in West Virginia, we need to briefly talk about the West Tech Company and their experiments on the West Coast. In Fallout 1, the West Tech Company had a research facility which was directly targeted by a nuclear bomb during the War of 2077. The crater left behind became known as the Glow, but when we explored the Glow, we found a still functional computer named Zax who told us about West Tech's Pan-Immunity Virion project. This project was started on September 15, 2073, in response to China's research into biological weapons. West Tech's goal was to create a substance that could alter human DNA to make people immune to whatever biological weapon China came up with. While this was going on, West Tech was also building a research facility in Appalachia, just a stone's throw away from the town of Huntersville. We learned from reading Gail Meyer's terminal in Huntersville that West Tech finished construction on their research facility nearby in August of 2075. In December of the same year, West Tech started paying some of the local farmers of Huntersville for testing rights at their farms. We learned why while exploring the West Tech research facility nearby. Inside the greenhouse control terminal, we learned that West Tech here in Appalachia was also working on the Pan-Immunity Virion project, but they had a very specific research focus. While on the West Coast they were trying to alter DNA to make humans immune to any biological weapons from China, here in Appalachia, they were using the Pan-Immunity Virion project to test the effects of mutations on edible plants and vegetation in a controlled environment. They called this their greenhouse initiative. Their ultimate goal was to find a combination of mutations that would make edible plants immune to viruses and bacteria, improve their growth, and ultimately end world hunger. But everything changed on March 21st, 2075. When the scientists at West Tech moved on from experimenting on single-celled organisms to more complex mammals, their subjects began showing an abnormal growth rate accompanied by increased brain activity. The United States military then became interested in West Tech's Pan-Immunity Virion project. Major Bartnett from the military began to order more mammalian experiments, which West Tech dutifully undertook throughout the rest of 2075 and into 2076. The US government, using the military, took over the project in 2076 and moved the West Tech research team working on the Pan-Immunity Virion project to the Mariposa military base. They then renamed the Pan-Immunity Virion project to the Forced Evolutionary Virus Project, or FEV. It was then in early 2077 that West Tech and the military began to experiment with FEV on human beings. Right about the same time in West Virginia, West Tech cancels the Greenhouse Initiative. Their staff who were working on the Greenhouse Initiative get reassigned to a new, as of yet, unnamed project. Soon after, the mood changes in Huntersville. The townsfolk are becoming less optimistic about their new neighbors, West Tech. The employees from West Tech stop coming through the town. They are no longer buying things like food and coffee from the vendors of Huntersville. And in February of 2076, people begin to fall ill, exhibiting flu-like symptoms. The sickness continues to get worse. A doctor from West Tech comes by to inspect everyone, but says they all just have the flu and they need to wait it out. But as their symptoms get worse and as people begin to turn green, the military arrives and orders a town-wide quarantine. We learned from the military's TAC Ops terminal on the outskirts of Huntersville that the soldiers working here to implement the quarantine were being ordered around by West Tech. Soon people from the town began going missing. Soldiers began knocking on doors and taking people away in the middle of the night, even ripping infants from the arms of their mothers.
On behalf of the U.S. Army and West Tech, you're hereby ordered to hand custody of your child, Dalton Sherman, over to us immediately.
What? Over my dead body. He's sick. He's not going anywhere.
Corporal Gibbons, put her in the body bag. Private Zaleski, go find the kid.
And those who resisted were killed. The duty officer, Sergeant Jake Bianchi, was horrified with what West Tech was having his unit do. He suspected that West Tech was somehow experimenting on the people of Huntersville, but before he could investigate his suspicions, he was dishonorably discharged and replaced. But Jake Bianchi's suspicions were right. While exploring the West Tech facility, we learned from the virology analysis terminal that their new project, to which they diverted all of the scientists who were working on the Greenhouse Initiative, was indeed experimenting with FEV. Much like how West Tech and the military began experimenting on human beings at the Mariposa military base on the West Coast, the scientists here began experimenting on the townspeople of Huntersville, and they did so by infecting their drinking water with FEV. Perhaps they did it out of convenience. Huntersville was the closest source of people. They had already been working with the farmers of Huntersville on the Greenhouse Initiative. Perhaps they already had infrastructure in place. Whatever the reason, Huntersville became West Tech's own personal petri dish. We learned from the Enclave's holotapes that we uncovered at the Mariposa military base during Fallout 2 that FEV can indeed travel through the air and soil. But its direct exposure to skin, being dipped in a vat of FEV that causes swift and dramatic mutation. The scientists in Appalachia, however, didn't want a fast mutation. They wanted to observe the people of Huntersville over an extended period of time. And so first they reduced the amount of chlorine dioxide that they included with the FEV they added to the water of Huntersville to decrease its effectiveness at disinfecting the virus. This presumably was to allow for greater infection amongst the populace. And second, they made sure to introduce the virus to a large water supply, which diluted it. It could still infect, but the diluted virus would infect the populace over a longer period of time. While the scientists at Mariposa experimented in their own way, the scientists here at Appalachia pursued their own unique experiments. The people from Huntersville who went missing were kidnapped by West Tech and brought to their research facility for further testing. One of the infected residents at Huntersville ended up leaving Huntersville, and one way the scientists experimented with preventing this from happening again was adding a pheromonic component to the FEV strain, which caused their test subjects to excrete pheromones that attracted dogs. Their idea was that if a mutant escapes in the future, their retention team would have an easier time of tracking them down with trained hounds. They eventually abandoned this idea because the pheromones they introduced to Huntersville ended up attracting more attention than they initially had hoped, and their ultimate goal was to keep this experiment at Huntersville a secret. But this experiment explains why we often see supermutants with supermutant hounds. Some strains of the virus still have that pheromonic component, which attracts dogs whom the supermutants then dip to turn into supermutant hounds. With this evidence, we can deduce that the strain of FEV that the Institute after the war sourced for their own experiments must have come from Appalachia. The Appalachian strain was the only one we know of with this pheromonic component, and yet the Institute's supermutants often travel with supermutant hounds. In the West Tech Research Building, we find large vats filled with FEV, and in the research wing, we find the corpses of the people of Huntersville mutated, floating in vats, laid out on operating tables.
I just want to go home. Home. Wife. Where's my wife?
She's fine, K-117M. Calm down, please.
No! What have you done to my wife? Bring her to me now! I'll kill all of you!
Code Red in Interrogation Room B. I repeat, Code Red!
We learned from the Advanced Mutations Lab that West Tech had difficulty finding a stable strain. Despite finding successes here or there, their test subjects would inevitably die. With every failed experiment came a new corpse to dispose of. Perhaps West Tech chose not to incinerate their victims for fear of aerosoling FEV. After all, we learned from Fallout 2 that FEV could travel through the air, and it did have an impact on people, though a much smaller one than having your skin directly exposed to FEV. So instead of incinerating all of their infected corpses, we discovered the horrifying truth of what they did to their victims while exploring the Emmett Mountain disposal site. After killing a Deathclaw, and while exploring a collapsed portion of the mine, we find piles of containers, most of which are crushed or closed, but a few of which are opened. And inside these containers, we find dismembered supermutant bodies. The only way these dismembered supermutant bodies could be enclosed in canisters we find buried in a pre-war mine is if before the bombs dropped, someone had created a supermutant, killed them, chopped them up, and placed them here. West-Tech are the only ones who could have done this. This is how they disposed of the people of Huntersville, whom they infected. In their quest to make the perfect American super soldier, they were successful at making people bigger, stronger, and immune to biological weapons, but the resulting mutants wouldn't last long, dying of heart failure, or as in one case, living with a nervous system that continued to grow, causing so much pain that the mutant committed suicide. The scientists, however, did achieve 2 viable successes. They found their first success by accidentally creating the Snallygaster, which escaped from the West-Tech research facility and fled towards Huntersville. They then altered the formula a little bit to create the Grafton Monster. The Grafton Monster was too large for their enclosure and it broke free. They managed to tranquilize it before it could leave the facility, but this all happened on October 23, 2077, the day the bombs dropped. After the bombs hit, the Grafton Monster woke up and escaped out into Appalachia. We learned from reading the control room terminal that the Great War took the scientists here completely by surprise. Supervisor Bardwell was in charge of the facility the day the bombs dropped, and he made sure all of his employees stayed put until they heard from Top Brass. But Top Brass never reached out to them. All communications were cut. So Supervisor Bardwell left the facility to try and reach out to the military who were stationed at Huntersville, but he never came back. That left only 2 technicians in charge of the entire research facility. After waiting and waiting for Bardwell to return or for anyone to contact them, they finally activated their backup plan, and that was to neutralize the FEV sitting in the big FEV tanks. They used a neutralizing agent, which unwound the FEV strain. The vats were still highly toxic and highly radioactive, which we discover when we explore them ourselves, but by jumping in the vats, we won't turn into supermutants. We learn more about this neutralizing agent when reading the Decontamination Research Terminal at the top of the Advanced Research Lab. I missed this terminal when I did my video on the West-Tech Research Facility, so I'll take the opportunity to read its contents for you here. We learned that the technician was Darren Spielman, and we find 4 logs. On May 3rd, 2077, Bardwell's all over my ass about getting the decontamination arches up and running. How the hell am I supposed to come up with a decontamination method for something that's totally experimental? To make matters worse, West-Tech HQ refuses to give me the FEV's chemical and organic breakdown, so I'm totally shooting in the dark. My degree in biochemistry never prepared me for this, but I should have known things would be different around here when I had to get high-level clearance just to walk in the door. Later that same month, on May 22nd, 3 weeks and about 60 compounds later, I've still got nothing. This FEV is some tenacious stuff. I know that FEV is virus-based, so I've approached it from that angle. Unfortunately, every antibiotic compound known to man isn't designed to handle something this, well, virulent. What I need to come up with is some sort of a booster, a total neutralizing agent that will render the FEV inert. Back to the drawing board. It's interesting that he would experiment with an antibiotic compound when trying to find a way to neutralize a virus, because antibiotics only work on bacteria, not viruses. Perhaps he didn't know that, which is why his experiments failed. Surprising for a guy with a degree in biochemistry. But something he tried eventually worked, as we learn on June 11th. Picture this, Bardwell standing there in his biohazard suit, yelling at me to get my ass moving to the decontamination arches. Worth sneaks up right behind him and dumps a canister of FEV right over his head. You should have seen his face. He freaked the hell out. He was screaming, rolling around on the floor. Hell, I think he was crying. I let it go on for almost a full minute before I activated the arches and let my neutralizing agent wash him off. Worked like a charm. I'm on a crap detail for the next 2 weeks for doing that to him, but it was totally worth it. Well, it sounds like in addition to being a neutralizing agent, he also invented a cure for FEV. After all, they dumped FEV on top of the guy. It had already touched his skin. Presumably he absorbed some of it. Presumably he was infected. If so, then like Virgil after him, he found a cure for FEV, though I suppose it's always possible that this particular strain was so slow-acting that the decontamination arches were able to neutralize it before his skin absorbed it. And in the final one, just a few days later, Bardwell's still pissed about my demonstration, but at least he's quit shouting at me. I've spent the last few days culturing thousands of gallons of my neutralizing agent, not only for use in the decontamination arches, but into emergency dump tanks. Apparently the folks back at West Tech HQ want a ripcord just in case this place is in danger of being captured or something. If you ask me, they're paranoid, but I just do as I'm told, like a nice little robot. This is the same ripcord the two final technicians pulled to neutralize the vats after the War of 2077. By neutralizing the vats, they could guarantee that no one would be exposed to FEV from the West Tech research facility, and so the two remaining technicians at West Tech abandoned the research facility. But if they neutralized FEV, why then do we find so many super mutants in Appalachia? Well, this brings us back to Huntersville's water source. Remember, West Tech infected their water supply. While exploring the outskirts of Huntersville, we find a river flowing from some nearby lakes. If we follow the river north, we eventually discover an unmarked location, some machinery off in the distance. This brings us downhill a bit, and we see that the river water stops at a little pool. But as we approach, a super mutant behemoth emerges from the water. And this gives us a clue as to why we see viable super mutants in Appalachia. Remember, all of the experiments at West Tech failed. But this behemoth, and all of the other mutants we have found, of course, are perfectly viable. Why? This question isn't answered explicitly for us with lore, so bear in mind this is just conjecture. But here's what I've got based on all the lore we know. Well, what the researchers at West Tech didn't have was omnipresent exposure to background radiation. That is one experiment they never undertook, to see whether or not exposure to radiation would somehow stabilize FEV in an infected human. But after the Great War of 2077, background radiation is everywhere. This behemoth has been sitting in a pool of water for God knows how long, infected by the FEV that West Tech pumped into Huntersville's water supply here, soaking in water highly irradiated from the Great War. Exposure to FEV turned him into a super mutant, exposure to radiation stabilized him so he didn't die, and exposure to more radiation caused him to grow to become the behemoth we find here. At this water pump, a stone's throw away from Huntersville, we find toxic barrels scattered all over the place, sitting in the water at the base of the pump, in the back of a nearby delivery truck. So much FEV had been dumped here that we see a green FEV haze at the bottom of the pump. So after the bombs dropped in 2077, survivors of the Great War discover the ruins of Huntersville. Huntersville with a population that had all been killed or kidnapped, but Huntersville, which has a water supply still infected with FEV. The survivors of the apocalypse move into Huntersville, drink the water, bathe in the water, absorb FEV into their skin, and turn into super mutants. Like the Institute breed and the Capital Wasteland's Vault 87 breed, the Huntersville breed of super mutant is very different from the Master's version. We recall from the events of Fallout 1 that the whole reason the Master was looking to enslave the people of Vault 13 was because he needed what the Lieutenant called prime normals.
I can't have a perfectly good prime normal and not make it one of the chosen ones, now can I?
these are pre-war people who have never been exposed to radiation from the Great War, or to FEV. Remember, it's the lieutenant who theorized that one of the reasons the Master's experiments have produced such stupid super mutants is because when the bombs created the glow, it aerosoled the FEV there, effectively inoculating everybody in the area to the strongest effects of FEV. Direct exposure will turn them into a super mutant, but not as great of a super mutant had they not been inoculated by the aerosoled FEV.
The FEV was mutated by the war radiation. Those living in this desolate wasteland have been exposed to this mutant FEV, essentially inoculating them from the full effects.
And of course, the only place to find a person who has never been exposed to radiation from the Great War is a pre-war vault. The Master needed prime normals because only a prime normal who had never been exposed to radiation from the Great War would turn into an intelligent super mutant when dipped in vats of FEV. Remember, the strain of FEV we find at Mariposa had been altered by the Master who had already mutated and developed psionic abilities. We know that Westtech was experimenting on humans at Mariposa, but we find no evidence that at any point they had become successful at creating the super mutants that they were trying to. So much like the Appalachian scientists, the scientists on the West Coast likely had a hard time creating a stable subject. The Master had developed a stable form. The problem is that all of the mutants were stupid. Finding a prime normal fixed the Master's stupidity problem. He didn't have a stability problem. Ironically, the very background radiation that made FEV stable in Appalachia so that super mutants didn't just die is also responsible for them all being so stupid. Years later, as the people of Appalachia began to rebuild, the Responders and the Brotherhood of Steel joined forces to eradicate what they thought was the source of super mutants in Appalachia. They correctly deduced that super mutants were coming from Huntersville, and so they undertook the Battle of Huntersville. We even find a holotape of Elizabeth Taggarty, the leader of the Brotherhood of Steel here in Appalachia, addressing her assembled troops.
Civilization. The Brotherhood and Responders together have paid a high price to make that word mean something in Appalachia, and the super mutants threaten all of that. Now, let's show these muties what we're made of.
The battle for Huntersville was a great success. The Responders and the Brotherhood completely wiped out the super mutants here. But then, of course, the Scorched event happened. The event which killed all of humanity here in Appalachia. And after that, the super mutants came back. I think this can only mean that the water of Huntersville is still infected with FEV even after all of these years. Now, we don't turn into super mutants by wading in the water near Huntersville, nor can we take a bath or drink water in Huntersville and turn into a mutant. Perhaps the poison in the water of Huntersville dissipated slowly over time. Perhaps it was strongest right after the Great War, leading to the horrible infestation of super mutants that the Responders and the Brotherhood faced. But since they didn't purify the corrupted water at Huntersville, perhaps raiders and wastelanders and scavengers continued to drink it and bathe in it after the battle, restocking the supply of super mutants in Appalachia. Then the Scorched event happened, killed all of the humans, removing the steady supply of new super mutants into Appalachia, but by then their supply had already been restocked, and by the time the doors to Vault 76 open, the virus had dissipated enough in the waters so that it no longer infects new humans. That's really the only explanation I can come up with for why we still find super mutants in Appalachia, and why the waters outside Huntersville don't turn us into super mutants. And that is the full story of how super mutants arrived in Appalachia. We have to remember that this all started with the best of intentions. Westtech just wanted to make Americans immune to Chinese biological weapons. Westtech just wanted to make a crop that was immune to diseases to cure world hunger. And Westtech ended up massacring an entire town in their pursuit of the greater good. What are your thoughts about the lore we learn about super mutants here in Appalachia? Let me know in the comments section below. I publish many Fallout videos each and every week here on my channel, so if you don't want to miss my next one, be sure to subscribe and to click that bell notification button. If you have and you feel like you're still not getting YouTube notifications, consider following me on Twitter at Oxhorn. I manually update Twitter with every new piece of content that I publish. I have a shirt shop with completely unique designs you can't find anywhere else. My designs come on shirts in a variety of men's, women's, and children's sizes, and in a wide array of colors. My designs come on other products as well, like smartphone cases, pillows, posters, mugs, stickers, prints, etc. So if interested, you can find a link to my shop in the description below, or you can click here. If you like what I do and you want to support me in a more personal way, consider becoming a patron on Patreon or a member here on YouTube. But more than anything, I'm just so glad you're here watching this video with me today. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you soon with more brand new videos.